Birthing from within mentors and doulas know that childbirth preparation starts far before the first childbirth class or even before one becomes pregnant. In fact, childbirth preparation begins in the formative years. Early on, children make sense of the world through language, and around age 5, 6, 7 years old, they've got enough language to start creating story. And story is the way that we make sense of the world and create a container for our experiences to help us have context and understanding of what happens to us and within the world around us. So often passively, children begin to learn sort of the rules and agreements for how to be in the world, how to get approval, how to get love, um, how to be seen as worthy. Children learn rules about relationships. They create stories about food. They create stories about work. They create stories about learning. And they create stories about birth. Now, there is a time when children don't know anything about birth. They don't know where babies come from. They don't know how people got here. Everyone in their life just somehow appeared. And yet one day, there's a threshold moment. There is a line in the sand where a child does learn something about birth. It may be something direct, like hearing the story about their own birth, or it could be something passive. It could be a conversation that they overhear. It could be something that they see on TV. It could be a fairy tale or hearing about a stork or a cabbage patch where babies come from. And suddenly now they have a creation myth. Now they have a story about how people come into this world. And it's relevant because everything that they learn about birth after that is contrasted against that first story or first collection of stories about birth. Now, the first birth story is the first birth plan. From that story, people start to formulate ideas about, oh, this is how birth is, or this is how birth should be. So when I grow up, I'm going to do this, or I'm not going to do that, right? People should do this, or people should never do that in birth or in parenting. So these are very innocent ideas, and they're very black and white ideas. They lack nuance because children don't have enough experience in the world and language to understand nuance. And so they can get into rather absolute thinking about birth, right? Babies always come out this way in our family. Things always go that way, right? One should never do this. So from those first impressions, they start to formulate ideas about birth. And if they go unexcavated, then oftentimes they will wind up habitually pulling that person along in a certain direction. Those early impressions will influence the kind of things that people are attracted to or the kind of things people have an aversion to in birth, whether that's a particular kind of class or a particular kind of birth space or things that they want to happen in the birth. Now, as mentors who have this knowledge and this wisdom that learning is a lifelong process about birth, we have an opportunity to do some excavation with parents. Now, a lot of people don't have that first birth story sitting right on the top of their head, so it's important to create a little bit of framework for them, right? It's important to ease into it so that parents don't feel pressured to produce some amazing first impression story about birth. But when you begin to discuss the first birth story in a way where you're just throwing out ideas, right, where um, children hit this threshold somewhere early in life, where they start to learn things about birth. They go from a place of not knowing to a place of knowing, and they form early impressions. They start to have ideas about how birth is or how birth should be. And it could come up in different ways, right? Letting parents know there are different examples. Like you may have seen someone give birth in a covered wagon in Little House on the Prairie. Or, what else? That you may have heard a story about a relative giving birth on the boat coming over to this country. That you may have been told your own first birth story, or maybe heard a great story like the Nativity story, right? To get an early understanding of birth. And so everyone has these stories or collection of stories that inform the way that they think about birth from a young age. And as parents, of course, people may have done research and all of this learning and taken classes and read books, but in their young mind, there are still ideas that they may be carrying about birth or may not have even thought about in years. And so when you present different examples like this and you create a framework about the first birth story, parents start a search in their mind. They're quietly searching as you're talking about examples of first birth stories and how they come to be, and the kind of impressions, lasting impressions that they can leave on people. So that as you're doing this, the parents are doing a little internal search in their mind. So that by the time you've completed your framework and built this scaffolding for this process that you're about to do, which really only takes a few minutes, they've got one hopefully bubbling to the surface. Now, if you're in a group, it can be nice to ask who's got an interesting story, because sometimes the first person who speaks up is going to be the one who says, I don't have any story. I don't remember anything about birth. So ask who has an interesting story. And frequently, the parent will then go to an adult-minded meaning for that story, right? So they'll tell the story, and when you ask, what kind of meaning do you suppose that you made out of that story, they might start to talk about interventions or inductions. And, unless that child was raised by a birth professional, they probably didn't have a story about induction when they were 5, 6, 7, 8 years old. Right? They probably didn't have a story about interventions or hospital policies. It was something broader than that. And so you can ask them, well, how old were you when you first heard this story? How old do you suppose that you were, if you had to guess? And then ask them to drop down into that 8-year-old mind and remember or imagine. When we say imagine, it opens up more space. Remember or imagine what the meaning might have been that you made of that story that you heard about your mom hearing someone screaming down the hall and saying she never had to scream like that during birth. Remember or imagine. Birth is this. Mommies are that. Birthing people are the other thing. Birth should look like this or should not look like that. Just remember or imagine what might have been the meaning that you made of that. And how do you suppose it has influenced the way that you're preparing for birth now? And oftentimes we'll see parents have a light bulb come on over their head. Oh, I never thought of it this way, right? I never realized how that was all connected, right? We can offer some validation, perhaps even expand the possibilities into, now that they're adults, they can begin to think even beyond that initial first birth story. We can't change the first birth story, but what we can do is excavate it. And what we can do is examine it from a place of curiosity, not from a place of judgment. And from there, once we have that awareness, we can begin to expand the awareness even more. So go out, take this out into your community and try it out with parents. See what kind of exciting things you discover about the first birth stories that people are holding.